Welcome. My name is Jim Robb. I'm the president of the National Training and Simulation Association, NTSA. For those new to NTSA, we are a nonprofit associated with association dedicated to facilitating dialogue between the government, industry, and academia on topics related to providing the best possible training and training systems for our warfighters and first responders. We host 9 events each year, the largest of which is AETC in December, which is the largest simulation conference and exposition of its kind in the world. This year, AETC is being transformed to a virtual platform. So stay tuned to that and keep going to the website for further information. So due to COVID-19, NTSA, like most others, have been forced to go to virtual worlds this year. But again, virtual worlds are in the sweet spot of the training simulation community. So this is really an opportunity for us to learn more about distance learning and how training in the virtual worlds can be of benefit. And we've had a couple of webinars this year on this very subject. And I think of all the things we do within 2020, pulling out, maximizing, and honing our virtual skills in terms of learning is one of the most important things we can do. As a meaningful way to enhance the critical dialogue while we've all been in our shelters, we brought together a team to develop and produce the webinars on topics of interest. So if you have something that you would like addressed, please send it to me personally and we'll put it on the docket. Today we have about 175 folks registered, and to show the outreach, they're from 10 different countries. So that's really a very powerful part of what we've been doing on the virtual side. So let me now, without any delay, introduce the moderator for today's event. Scott Erb served in the U.S. Navy for 26 years in a variety of roles, including Destroyer Command. He taught ethics and leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy and had command of the Navy Center for Security Forces, where he was responsible for security, force protection, and riverine warfare training worldwide, a very big task. He is currently the founder and owner of Promethean Blue, LLC. He's helping companies connect advanced research to the needs of the warfighters, also build cyber tools for the warfighters, plan business strategy in a really rapidly changing world, and consider the ethical impacts of autonomy. So without delay and with great appreciation for your participation today, let me turn it over to Scott. Scott, over to you.
Good morning, Admiral. Thank you for the kind introduction and welcome everybody to the September webinar. Today's conversation is about the promises and limitations of scaling up online training and education. What lessons have we learned in the past 6 months and how might they impact the future of education and training in both the civilian and military worlds? Our panelists today are both very well qualified to discuss online training and education. Dr. Lisa Tripp is the Technical Director for the Air Education and Training Command Studies and Analysis Squadron, where she directs AETC-wide studies, analyses, and assessments in the areas of recruiting, training, and educating airmen. She previously conducted research on training effectiveness as the C4ISR Training Research Team Lead for the Air Force Research Laboratory. She holds master's degrees in applied mathematics and experimental psychology and a doctorate in experimental psychology from Washington State University. John Schwartz is the head of global business development at edX. He is part of the team that drives edX's engagements with prospects and partners, including foundations, non-governmental organizations, corporations, and local and international governments. His career has been focused on driving business development for companies in a variety of industries, including education technology, automotive, pharmaceutical, publishing, and finance. He also has experience in strategic marketing and branding with an emphasis on experiential design. Most recently, John was a board member and chief strategist at Hudson & Cutler, a technology-driven marketing and communications company. John is a graduate of Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Welcome to our panelists. In addition to our panelists, we've received many thought-provoking questions from the audience. And of course, if you have questions during today's webinar, you can send those to the panel in the chat box. Finally, we have a couple of audience participation polling questions that we'll use to help keep today interactive. So let's jump right in by asking the panelists to give some initial thoughts. Over the past 6 months, as we've had the opportunity to very rapidly transition to online learning, what have you seen as the biggest opportunities and limitations? Let's start with Dr. Tripp.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. So first, I'd just like to express that the opinions I share are solely my own and not necessarily the same as the views of AETC or the Air Force. And really, what we're looking at from an AETC perspective, AETC has a very broad scope and a mission that includes recruiting, training, and educating exceptional airmen. And the areas that I've been fortunate enough to work in are just a tiny sample of the extensive work that AETC has been doing to enhance both the lethality and the readiness and to really transform the way we learn. The Air Force's new Chief of Staff, General Brown's message to the Air Force Association recently, I think really sets the stage in that we really have to accelerate change or lose, especially in this highly dynamic environment that we're looking at in COVID and even broader than that. He discussed from a service perspective that really we can't count on significant end strength growth. We have to make better use of the airmen that we have if we want to really be prepared. And really, in my opinion, to do this effectively, we need to push the envelope and innovate in these areas of virtual training, distance learning, and training in general to increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of training and to enhance our agility and readiness of personnel. As COVID started, I expected huge degradations in our ability to maintain our schedule and our throughput of trainees. And what I've been really excited about is we really didn't see that overall. The Air Force for about the past 20 years has been pushing to identify what are the areas that we can transition into distance or online learning. And a lot of the reason for that is because we have such a global distribution of personnel, and our ability to continue to improve and have that professional development, professional military education, and continuous development really depends on our ability to have distance learning. So from that perspective, we didn't really see a whole lot of change with COVID in those areas. But I think what's interesting from the challenges perspective is that a lot of things stayed the same for the Air Force. When we looked at what's happened with basic military training, a lot of our technical training, maintenance training, pilot training, what the Air Force did from that perspective was to say, okay, this is mission essential, let's keep going. And when I got the call about participating in this panel, I was really excited because I think that those are the areas that there's a lot of room for continued evolution in, and there's challenges in terms of how do you do the right team building? How do you build trust for these high risk environments that folks are going into? How do you simulate the physical stressors that a pilot would see, such as G-forces, that even with the best sims, we can't necessarily tell whether someone that's going to transfer well and they're going to be able to physically withstand the G-forces and operate effectively in a real world environment. So this combination of the physical stressors and the psychological stressors that you get with, for example, being in the actual aircraft versus being in the sim are really hard to replicate in your traditional virtual environments or through some distance learning. So I'm excited to get to talk to the group and hopefully get some folks to start thinking about how we can build up additional capabilities in those areas. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Scott.
Okay, thanks. So it sounds like that there were some good surprises in some areas where online learning might not yet be the best tool.
Definitely.
John, what have you seen?
So Lisa brought up some really, key points. I mean, from our perspective, for those that don't know edX is a not-for-profit founded and funded by both Harvard and MIT and 140 of the top universities and enterprises in the world. And, this last 6 months has been absolutely a whirlwind on so many different levels. I think some of the big takeaways, which we've all seen is, by everybody being remote, everybody was forced to learn remotely. And platforms like edX and other platforms filled an immediate void in a very difficult situation, considering the light switch was flipped in just a matter of weeks. I've got 3 young kids. They were in school. All of a sudden, they weren't in school and they were online learning. And if we look from a global perspective, the tens of millions of learners in government, enterprise, the armed forces, there was a huge scramble to figure out how to continue on this learning and development path with the least amount of disruption. And I'm happy to say, and I think we on this panel are happy to say, that platforms like edX and other platforms that were being utilized had already had all the key infrastructure in place. There was no scalability issues for our platform. We added millions of learners in the last 6 months. And most importantly, in many, many cases around the world, we're able to really, fill that gap. So the disruption of learners, both in enterprise that we're now working remotely, and from academia in colleges, high schools, really went seamlessly, all things considered. So, we're seeing just tremendous buy-in to this new way of doing things and this hybrid model. And it'll be really interesting to see the path that this takes, when we can resume some of the normal learning and development that we were traditionally used to.
Interesting. So it sounds like from your perspective, it's almost ushering in a golden age of remote learning.
I mean, look, for those of us in the online space, we know that this has been around, for the better part of 8 years, and we've all been collective evangelists and advocates for the efficacy, for the learning outcomes, for, the intimacy that online provides, the immersive two-way engagement. But a lot of people, were somewhat reluctant. This was a real propulsion forward. And I think we collectively look at this as tremendous progress. Yes, it all happened in very unfortunate circumstances, but I mean, we can give you endless success stories, globally, from organizations that had little or no experience prior, that were able to jump right in, keep their people on a learning and development path, and fill a void and let people see that, hey, this works. It's agile, it's cost effective, it's time efficient, and really, speak to all those things that, in some ways were really theoretical until it went into practice.
That sounds really fantastic. Have you been able to measure any initial results? And if so, what are you seeing in terms of both the effectiveness and the efficiency?
So, the simple way, certainly and to be as concise as possible, if we look at it from a standpoint of, in the last 6 months, our platform added roughly 6-7 million new learners. Registrations were up tenfold. And how we measure success is seeing amongst those millions of people, how many people successfully completed the courses. This is a terrific indication of all the enhanced benefit of the content, the pedagogy of the content, and all the other important online learning tools that go into making an online course. So we can already see in just the 7 months that literally millions of brand new learners have come onto the platform, have taken a variety of courses, in all different kinds of subjects, and to their credit and to the organizations that they're part of, whether it's government or armed force or enterprise, have successfully completed it. And we're only seeing those numbers increase because, again, there's a forced adoption. And people really are truly seeing that this is something that can work, in any environment. I think to Lisa's point, certainly there's always limitations. And I think Lisa and I would both agree that nobody's advocating, in person or online exclusively. But in this new world, I think we're going to see a truly, unique hybrid model where both have a place in all learning and development.
Lisa, what has the Air Force been seeing in terms of measuring the initial results?
For this, I think I'm going to talk a little bit less about the online and more about some of the work that we've been doing in AR, VR that I think could be pushed in the future to distance learning applications. So, for example, one of the things that the Air Force has been doing is several different what we call learning next efforts, really looking at what are some emerging technologies that we can integrate into some of our traditional pipelines like undergraduate pilot training and crew chief fundamentals training in order to really leverage those technologies to get into the areas like self-paced learning and increase the efficiency at which students are getting through the programs, as well as things like decrease the amount of time we have students awaiting training between different levels of those particular trains. And some things that we've seen for Maintenance Next that have been really successful are partnership with places like Clarkston University, where they had in January some ROTC cadets at Detachment 536 that actually were able to receive real-time instruction remotely from fully qualified Air Force pilots sitting at an airport in Louisiana. So our ability to have specialists all across the globe that can do that distance learning, even for these highly technical areas, in a lot of ways has been very successful. However, we also see some continual challenges, like I mentioned in the opening remarks. For example, for Maintenance Next, we had a number of different companies come and develop different pieces of a course. And one of the challenges is trying to identify what all a student is learning with these interactions. So the traditional course would have someone actually physically with a part task trainer do something like a tire change for an aircraft. And originally, the developers of some of the course material thought that, well, how realistically do I have to represent certain aspects? And, it's just a tire change. Let's go take them through the steps. But the problem is an aircraft tire is very heavy. So it can be dangerous if it falls a particular way. The same thing was true of some of the panels, where in the virtual environment, those aspects of the size and the weight weren't effectively represented. And so some of the students came out not really understanding those physics and sometimes thinking that they could do something individually that really is a two-person job. So there's some definite risks to those individuals going through that training. And how do we predict that? How do we predict going in what is really learned in that environment? It's not just the steps, it's that holistic environment of the weight. How much pressure do I have to put on a particular tool to be able to take something off or tighten something appropriately? It's all those psychomotor skills as well as the understanding of those relationships and weights that are more challenging for content developers to, I think, integrate into some of these technologies. And it's in predicting where those are and really understanding how to represent that I think we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, are there any initial best practices that you and your team have come across?
So I think something that's been really successful with both Maintenance Next and Pilot Training Next is iterative development. So continuing to pilot small segments and having those true subject matter experts in the domain there the entire time to help to work to predict some of those things. I would say for the most part that's been very effective. There are still obviously things that we're learning through this iterative process in terms of representing weight, how much force, all those different aspects that go into that physical environment.
Do you see the potential for some of the online learning tools to shorten the familiarity phase and get the airmen into doing the actual tasks more quickly than maybe they did before?
Absolutely. Some of the initial results that we've seen by using online learning and allowing it to be more self-paced is substantial decreases in the amount of time it takes students to go through fundamental training. And those results aren't completely in yet, so I can't talk to any specifics, but I'll say a lot of times in these, we're seeing up to a 30% or greater decrease in the amount of time it takes to go through some of these programs. And the other thing that has been successful is as some of these virtual capabilities are getting lower cost, they're allowing students to take certain capabilities home and practice at home, giving that 24-hour access that also is really increasing the rate at which we can get individuals through training and could be very viable for later scaling.
John, are you seeing something similar on your side of things with the ability to self-pace actually speeding up the learning?
Yeah, excuse me, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the whole concept of online learning, which is really unbundling the learning process, right? You're unbundling the content, you're unbundling the cost, and you're unbundling time. And to be able to work on a 24/7 basis whenever you have that dedicated time just makes you a better learner. And to some of what Lisa said, you know, if you look at platforms like Lisa and I are using, and you look at edX specifically, you know, there's a heavy focus on the neuroscience of learning. So, you know, we're ensuring that learners globally, when they take a course, are going to achieve the best learning outcomes, because as we all know now, and this is really, I think, a big differentiator with online learning, is that the skills that people are learning are skills they need to use, whether they're in the Air Force, Navy, government, and courses are designed to ensure that those learners have those skills, can use those skills, can utilize those skills in any environment. So having that ability in a self-paced course, you know, and having those global discussion forums, which give a level of immersiveness and two-way engagement, so you feel as if you're doing it, you know, together, really impacts the outcome. And we can see, as I mentioned before, you know, the success rate of people that are in the verified track, meaning they're getting their certificate of completion from that university, you know, is circa 70% and better, which I think, you know, aligns to university standards, and in some cases, I think even a little bit higher.
You mentioned the neuroscience of learning. It seems like this shift is going to give us a lot more data on learning styles and learning outcomes. How is that being fed back to the researchers to help improve our knowledge of the neuroscience of learning?
Sure. There's a certain amount of data analysis, you know, where we're able to track learners. Remember, some of these courses have over 2 million learners in it. So we can look at where learners are stumbling with assessments, or where, you know, a video should be inserted, and we can work very closely with those universities in giving them, you know, this is the best example of big data, right? We're collating lots of information, you know, about these courses based on professors' input, based on the learner input, and based on the success that those learners are having. So, you know, it's amazing that we're constantly reinforcing and improving the way online learners learn. And because we have this very elite ecosystem of content providers, both, you know, again, from a nonprofit, academic, and enterprise perspective, and, you know, there's a tremendous sharing across all three of those disciplines in terms of best practices and how we can continue to accelerate those learning outcomes.
Okay, let's try going to our first polling question, if we can, if Juliana's there. This is the one about how well has online training successfully scaled in the time of COVID? Perfect.
Well, Lisa, I can start there. And, you know, kind of as I said before, it, again, through unfortunate circumstances, the reality is, you know, every family, every enterprise, every government, every armed service went virtually online. I don't think there's a person in the world that wasn't somehow touched or affected by the need and the ability to be able to do some, you know, remedial navigation online. And again, while I sit from one particular platform and one perspective, you know, as I said, we saw registrations go up tenfold. we saw millions of new learners onto the platform, successfully completing courses. We talked to many universities that weren't able to pivot with their in-classroom content and use our content to supplement, so learners, were not interrupted and could finish their last semester. So, clearly there was a massive shift, and we would hold out an extremely successful one that continues to grow exponentially, and is giving us tremendous insight, as I mentioned before, on how we, in the learning and development and online digital space can consistently, enhance the offering.
Okay, so we've got the poll results back. I think they're on everybody's screen. Lisa, do these poll results surprise you? And if so, how?
No, I would say, I think this makes sense. From my perspective, the infrastructure was there substantially before COVID. I was reading a GAO report the other day that was given to Congress back in 2003, and it was talking about how even in the 1950s, we were pushing towards distance learning. For the military, I think a lot of that rationale and why we had that push so early is because we are so geographically separated, and we have expertise all over the globe that we really want to be able to leverage and get people the training they need no matter where they're stationed. So we had pushed to print-based in the 50s. By the 90s, we were already looking at what are the courses, what are the technical training courses, what are the Air University courses that we should be moving over to online. And we had a substantial shift after 2000 for several of the courses. I think at least 13 of the technical training courses were online by that point, and we have a lot of the professional military education online as well. Our ACSC, our Air War College, we have online master's degrees available. So for the Air Force, I think we've pretty much continued that online training push that we've been looking at for many years. Now, a lot of it is more your traditional online training, and I think really where we're going next is how do we use these new capabilities like AR, VR to really increase the domains that we're going in. It's one thing to talk about learning mathematics or data science or biology or history online, but now we're looking at how do we do things like maintenance training, pilot training, how do we use those capabilities for some of these more skill-based things that we're trying to train people in, those skills and abilities, and those larger things that maybe aren't so much in the knowledge realm, like how do we get people to better understand task management in an airplane using the online capabilities that are coming out, the AR, VR, risk management, those types of larger competencies that we're looking for.
Okay, and John, it sounds like your experience has been a little bit more positive than the poll reflects.
Yeah, but again, a lot of what Lisa's doing is more specialized, and we completely agree that between 4D and high def and green screen technology and augmented reality and virtual reality, it certainly brings another dimension, and all those things, as Lisa aptly said, are currently in the works, and I think we're going to see in this new positive world, a lot of these things come into online courses in a variety of ways. So it adds a whole nother dimension to the learning experience.
Yeah, Lisa, you mentioned adding AR and VR into the mix, and I was thinking about an old black and white movie I watched as a kid of astronaut training, where they had a mock-up of the space capsule at the end of one of those arms that they spin you around and put you under G-forces. Do you think that AR and VR might help in a situation like that where we can build an environment to replicate the physical stress, but still take advantage of some of the new technology for learning?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was thinking that as well when I was doing a little bit of reading on how they train pilots to go through G-forces, and it's a lot of times not in the aircraft, it's actually in some of the technologies that you were talking about, your centrifuge-like capabilities. So could we potentially build up environments that have some of those physical stressors and replicate them? I think definitely. I don't think there's a lot of people looking at that technologically. That might be a really interesting growth area. Are there ways we can replicate the physical and the psychological stressors that are experienced? I think if you talk to mostly instructor pilots today and ask them, do your students respond in the same way to emergency procedures in an aircraft as they do in the sim? And I think you'll hear absolutely not. They have that additional understanding when they're in that platform. So training in a sim for those things is very valuable to understand the procedures, the steps, how to do them. But in terms of really developing that capability so that they can rapidly implement it in an emergency situation, being able to replicate that stress and that risk to one's personal life, I think is really important. Figuring out, are there ways that we can build that in to those, or build that stress inoculation, if you will, into some of those environments to increase that transfer from the sim to those real world events.
So it sounds like replicating that perception of personal risk is something that's difficult.
Yeah, it definitely is. I was reading some papers a few times ago about how to replicate stress. And interestingly, the main methodology they came up with was public speaking and being observed by your peers. And they were saying that when they were looking at, I believe it was cortisol levels and various things, they were seeing similar cortisol levels in certain of those situations. But in my opinion, there's a lot of work to be done in that area. I don't really think we've solved how to replicate those stressors. And I think that's definitely an area where there's a lot of potential for growth.
I think having 3 kids under the age of 14 that are home 24/7 online learning with 2 parents that work full time, I bet that would be a good indication as well.
Okay, just a reminder for the audience, if you have questions for John and Lisa that you'd like to direct to either one or both, please send those in the chat box in the app here. In the meantime, we'll pull a question from the audience submissions from your registrations. This one I think is related to the last one. For either or both panelists, what are your high-level questions or concerns as government and industry work together to advance AR and VR training applications?
I'm going to give that to Lisa.
Okay. I'll take that one. I think it's related to what I've already talked about, but I think it maybe deserves another foot stomp. So I guess the 3 main questions that I would put forward are, how do we predict or detect the deficiencies in AR training prior to the trainees actually making the mistakes? I talked a little bit earlier about the maintenance training and the importance of understanding the weight of relative components. Is it heavy? Is it sharp? What's the risk of it dropping? How do we start to look at, all those environmental factors and how to appropriately understand what those risks are and put that in a learning environment so that when they come out, they have that ability to do appropriate risk management, which I think a lot of times when we focus on developing the training content, we're very procedure focused. I think we need to move into looking at some of those other areas, the situation awareness, the task management, the risk management, and making sure that that's also something the trainees are taking away from that training experience. I think the second one is, the psychomotor components. We talk about a lot of the development being in the areas of understanding the knowledge, but in terms of things that really require that psychomotor, if you think about it from a university, this might be something like, how would you train football? Can we teach someone to read the plays in AR/VR? Sure. Could we teach them to start to look for the cues of when someone is blitzed? Yeah, probably. But can we teach a quarterback to throw a football with today's AR, VR, and sensor technologies? Knowing how much pressure to apply to throw it 30 yards, looking at how it's going to react to the wind, all those types of things that go into really being able to accurately throw a football. I don't think the environments are there or the sensors are there today to replicate those. And we have several areas in the military environments with the same kinds of complications and concerns. And if we want to be able to move towards primarily AR, VR, and really reduce the live aspect, needing the actual platform, how do we get at training those psychomotor components? What's the right combination of the training capability, the live, and the additional sensors so that we can start to really look at those things? And I think the last thing, and this is what we talked about before, is really understanding how do we replicate that stress. And just to go into that a little bit deeper, a lot of the psychology literature talks about context-dependent memory and environmental context. And one thing that we're seeing is moving somebody from a sim to an live platform. A lot of times the instructors will say, well, they just forgot everything. They brain dumped it. I don't know where it went. I think part of that could be related to this idea of what they're learning in the context of the sim, and all of the cues that they're using are different when they get into that live aircraft. So are there ways to reduce the impact of that environmental context on learning and improve memory retrieval in these other contexts to improve that transfer of training?
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what I took from that was trying to predict negative training outcomes where you think you're training people on one thing, but you're actually training them on something different, whether that's a motor, maybe that's a motor skill that is different on a computer than it is in a cockpit, which relates to the psychomotor component of both, the skills and the environment. And then context changes between the virtual world and the real world and doing training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the audience. So we'll go to this one from Robert. Have you found the effectiveness of online training is higher for acquiring science, mechanical skills in comparison to art skills?
I'll give that to John.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that somewhat generically. So again, because every MOOC on our platform goes through a very intense, what we call like development checklist, whether it's history, whether it's social sciences, or again, the key things that a platform like edX focuses on, meaning all the core key competencies that we know every organization, whether it's the armed forces, government, or enterprise, such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, data analytics, data science, the Internet of Things. I think we would collectively say that the learning outcomes are equal across the board. These are highly effective courses where, there's many components to ensure the best learning outcomes. So again, I think there's probably a better, more granular answer, but considering we have 3,000 courses in a variety of key competencies or key skill-based competencies, we do not see a drop-off in one discipline over another.
Okay, thanks, John. Another question here from Mark. This is probably a Lisa question. Who have you seen actively using AR to enhance training? There's a desire to connect with other system integrators to apply it to my unit's mission.
So I think AR and VR is being used across multiple different areas in the Air Force. I think the two that I could talk to most are the maintenance training. I think that's been done a lot at ITSIC, and I've seen it a lot in the commercial. We're looking at it specifically for crew chief fundamentals training, and we found that it's very effective, allowing it to be self-paced, being able for students to have more repetitions. So I would say areas in which it's either higher risk for them, for a student to have a lot of repetitions in the real world environment, or in areas in which maybe the part task trainer or the trainer would be very expensive, like being able to have an aircraft tire sim, or some of the larger part task trainers that they use for maintenance training. What we've seen is the ability for students to practice and go through a higher number of repetitions than we could allot time for on those part task trainers. So in those areas, we've seen a lot of advances and a lot of students gaining competency faster in certain areas. And I think the same thing is true for the pilot training as well, in that emergency procedures and some of those higher risk, higher stress areas. We see a lot of improvement when they're in the sim because they can get more of those repetitions in that safe environment.
Okay. I'll throw this next audience question to John. This is from Danielle. Can you imagine a day when someone could learn how to drive a car or even fly a plane without ever having trained live in the car or the plane? What conditions would need to exist for such a scenario to happen?
I think this is clearly a Lisa question or answer. Not to deflect.
Could I ever imagine it? Yes. Do I think we're close to someone being able to do it and really develop expertise in an area? I would probably argue not really. And I think a lot of that is being able to replicate that more holistic environment. A lot of times we use those trainers to train basic skills. For example, driving a car, how to control the wheel to stay inside your lane, maybe how much pressure to put on a pedal, where the brake is, where, when to shift, maybe if anybody still drives a manual, when to put the clutch in. But, some of the higher level skills, the dual task performance that you need to be effective, to look at, is there somebody crossing the road in front of me while the radio's on and your phone just rang, and all of those different things, as well as you hit a pothole, and just how to deal with some of those things. I think are hard to holistically represent, especially in areas, driving on ice might be a really good example instead of a pothole. Driving on ice is something where you can tell people, and maybe even you can make the road a little bit slippery in the virtual environment, but there's definitely more cues and indicators that are represented in the real world that help you understand that and understand those relationships that I don't think are well represented, in the same way that we can't really represent G-forces in the way that we would want to for pilot training in that virtual environment. So I think there's still some gaps and limitations in what we're representing well, but that doesn't mean that we can't progress and eventually do that. I think there's just some existing challenges there that we've yet to overcome.
So it sounds like a realism of the unpredictable sort of challenge.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's those higher level skill sets and cues that we just aren't necessarily building into the environment today.
Okay. John, you mentioned one of the ways to replicate stress is to have 3 K through 12 students doing virtual learning at the same time. And I have a high schooler and a college student who are both doing various amounts of virtual learning. It seems to me like most of their teachers are attempting to replicate the classroom on a Zoom meeting or a Google Meetup. Is that the best method, or are we heading down maybe not the optimal path there?
So in deference to all the teachers out there that fill such a critical role to our children's, learning and development, I have to say that in many cases, remember, teachers that had never, and I'll use my children's school as an example, teachers that had been teaching in some cases 30, 35 years had never taught an online class, had virtually no experience, in ever doing anything even resembling taking any of their classes and doing it remotely. And as we all know, they had, in the case of my children, they were on their spring break. They had less than 2 weeks to completely pivot. So to their credit, and their determination and stamina, like everybody else in the world, they were doing their best to make sure that the interruption to in classroom, was as seamless as possible. But aside from that, and an answer to your question, teaching online is much, much different than teaching in the classroom. And I would say and argue that the tools that you can utilize in an online environment, and Lisa did a tremendous job in highlighting many of those, can all be encapsulated, in remote learning. The challenge and what you're referring to specifically is that teachers didn't know how to utilize, the technology because it was relatively new. So everything that was, part of their normal curriculum in classroom really needs to get shifted. For example, you can't do 45 minutes straight of talking to students, no matter what age they are. We know from the neuroscience of learning that after 5 minutes, people are going to get tired of listening to me speak. So I need to pivot and throw in an assessment or a quiz or a short video or even a break. So there's lots of tremendous tools that universities and enterprises on our platform are using to make sure that we are keeping the attention to online learners and making the experience something that's engaging, immersive. And again, back to some of Lisa's points about where we're going in the future, we'll make sure those learners want to come back and continue to learn in an online environment. So, bottom line, certainly hats off and kudos to the tens of thousands of teachers that really stepped up in a really difficult time and did a absolutely tremendous job in something that was relatively, completely unknown to them prior to people having to be quarantined.
Yeah, absolutely. Question for Lisa. Do you see our experience in the last 6 months with accelerating the online learning, shifting the LVC training construct more strongly in favor of the virtual and constructive?
So that's a good question. So when we talk about live, virtual, and constructive, live, what I think about is somebody in an actual platform. So somebody flying a T6 or a F-16. When I think about virtual, I think about somebody in a sim for one of those platforms, a T6 sim or an F-16 sim, and constructive being those computer-generated entities that you use in the training environment. So maybe in an F-16 sim, that's your adversaries. So from one perspective, I think what we're seeing is a lot of people pushing forward in terms of the AR, VR environment that gives us a lot more capabilities to represent cues. I definitely think we're moving in the right direction, and the things that we're able to train in the sim are increasing every day. However, I go back to kind of the last question, could we ever fully get away from live? And I think for a lot of training, the answer is no. I think there's always going to be that component, or at least for the foreseeable future, there's always going to be a component until we figure out how do we represent those physical stressors and those psychological stressors that we really need people to train for when we're talking about a dynamic, high-risk military type environment.
Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes left here, and I wanted to ask each of you to comment maybe on a two-part question. The first part, what has been the most surprising observation that you've had from the past 6 months? Maybe there's something that we thought was true about online learning in February that we now believe isn't true. And then as kind of the wrap-up question, how do you think virtual training and education will look 5 years from now?
Yeah, I'll start. I think the first part of the question is, I think what was so, unbelievable is that, again, in the world that I think most of us on this call collectively lived in, there was still a lot of concern and maybe questions and challenges with online learning. And we certainly saw in the global marketplace, in particular cases, a hesitancy to really jump in. And that's something that people like, I believe Lisa and I, and you, Scott, to some degree, have been, championing, I gotta say that word, advocating and evangelizing, for the last 8 years. What we saw happen in March was, and I hate to use the word unprecedented because it's overused, but it really was. It really did feel, from our collective perspective, that everything that we knew we could accomplish and we knew we could achieve, and the value and the learning outcomes, people, seemed to just accept it. There was no more, we want to kind of pilot it, we want to kind of try, we'll take people were forced, and when people are forced, it was the most amazing thing to see people truly come together. And when they knew that this is the only option for their foreseeable future, the way they were able to embrace it. And so, I don't want to say for me personally, who spends a lot of time, who really believes in the value of online learning and the ability to access this incredible content that 8 years ago wouldn't have been available, and now see it in practice and see the success that learners were having in such a short amount of time, what was really amazing and very satisfying for an organization like edX that's a not-for-profit whose sole goal during COVID was to help, in many cases for free, as many displaced learners as we could around the world. And as to the future, and again, I think I'll use Lisa's line, speaking for myself, we certainly believe online learning is going to be part of any curriculum, whether it's an armed force, government, or enterprise. The degree to which it either surpasses or replaces or supplements live, I think that needs to be determined by the organization involved. And I want to be also crystal clear, I don't think anybody in online learning is advocating for one way or another, but I think for those of us in online learning, we see that there can be a hybrid model where there's absolute benefits to having in-person learning for socialization. I don't want my children to spend their next 6 years before college exclusively online. I want them to have an enriched in-person environment with other students, classmates, and their teachers. But there's certainly a new realm and a new opportunity for schools and enterprises to incorporate some part of online learning, considering the frequency in which we know all learners, lifelong learners, are going to need to be reskilled and upskilled in the future.
Okay, thanks. Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I would mostly agree. So back when everything was happening in March and we were seeing everybody go to 100% telework, my perception was that, oh my gosh, what is this going to do to our training pipeline? And like John was saying, I think the most surprising thing is the answer is not much. In April, right after we started seeing all these effects, AETC ended up shortening basic training from 8.5 weeks to 7. We saw the number of trainees drop from 700 a class to 460, but we were able to rapidly adapt. And By June, we had brought back the 700 to 800 person classes, and 6 months later, I've been out to Lackland a couple times, up to Shepherd a couple times to look at basic military training and technical training and to get a better sense of what's going on there. And what we've seen is, we're still doing, as General Webb said, some preventative measures, but really COVID didn't bring our training production to its knees. We've been able to continue because of all the prior work that had been done in the distance learning, as well as for some of these basic military and technical training applications, our ability to rapidly adapt. So I've been really impressed and surprised by how effective we've been and how little degradation we've actually seen in the training pipeline. And as far as the future, as John was saying, I think some of the most challenging aspects, as we talked about, representing the environment, ensuring you have the socialization and the teamwork and the development of trust that you need to be successful operationally. And I think as we research and as we look more into how do we build this holistic environment, and I think with some of the AR/VR technologies, there is definitely a lot more potential than we're using today. We're going to start to see an increase in the number of things that we can train within these environments. And I think the other thing that really helps us with that research, as it was mentioned earlier, was our ability to collect data within these environments. In the traditional classroom, we're pretty much restricted to progress checks, pop-up quizzes, tests, but in these virtual environments, we can be collecting data every second about how they're doing, how they're progressing. Even things like eye tracking can tell us things about attentional allocation. We have so much more data that we can employ to really make a better, more tailored, more personalized learning experience. And I expect those things to just continue to increase and to get better over the next 5 years.
No, thank you. It sounds like we are kind of on the cusp of a golden age of online learning. Well, thank you both for joining the panel today, John and Lisa. It's been fantastic. Thank you also to the audience for the thoughtful questions that you've sent in through the course of the discussion. And now I'll turn it back over to Admiral Rob for his closing remarks.
Hey, thanks, Scott. That was a really terrific panel, and thanks for everybody participating. It covered a lot of ground, and it was really terrific. This is the first time that I actually received a question from the audience. So had a question that, when will driving cars and flying planes be without people? So I wrote an article last November for the NDIA magazine talking about the future of training, and the examples that we see are the use of if you just take the progression of flying, for example, we've gone to where we flew the airplane 100% of the time to now we fly the airplane about 10% of the time, and there certainly will be a time where the airplane can fly itself. And that is certainly dependent on the progressions in AI and all that. But our philosophy here at NTSA is, you let the automation work where it makes sense, and use all these really great systems to augment the humans. So the man-machine team grows. It's always been a team, and to what degree it's going to look like where you're in the car, the machine's driving it. That's not a big deal, and it'll happen over time. One of the examples I use all the time about training per se is with the airlines. The airlines go through literally 100% of their training in a simulator. And the first time that a co-pilot actually gets in a real airplane is when there's people in the back of the airplane. Now that's somewhat scary, but that's true. And that just goes to say that in some cases, with fairly stable, it's not a G thing, it's not a, that you can do, very extreme things in the simulator and get to a very high level of qualification. So this just to be thrown out there. I want to also, just point out that we want to find the places where live training works best, and also where virtual can support live training. And that's where we talked about sets and reps and things like that. That's very important. When you talk about pressure, I certainly never thought I was going to die in a trainer. However, I knew my career was on the line when I was in there as to how I performed. So you'd come out of a simulator sweating most of the time, and so I think that lots of training I've seen has gotten people's heart pumping to the point where they're pretty energized. But anyway, this is a great conversation. We will continue this over time. This isn't going to stop tomorrow or the next day. This is a journey on the education side, and I think we have a wonderful opportunity with sort of the forcing function of COVID and the COVID-like, as I said earlier, to go through and build the lessons learned and to actually expand how we use virtual training. I'd like to also thank our team that puts the webinars together. Daniel Surfete from the Aptima Corporation is the chairman of our webinar committee. I thank him. Bob Kleinhampel from SAIC. Ms. Julia Sly, CEO of Government Business Results LLC, does our polling questions. Debbie Langelier and Ms. Renee Despot from NTSA, and Dr. Linda Brent from, who's the CEO of ASTA Corporation, is a senior consultant for me. This is a webinar series. In October, on the 28th of October at 11 Eastern, we will spotlight the healthcare industry and their response to COVID-19. I think you may remember in the very early going of the COVID response, where we brought people back from the ships, and it was very on, that they went to the University of Nebraska Medical Center, which has a state-of-the-art brand new facility to do this kind of work. So we're going to have a session in October that discusses from their perspective how that was managed, the different situation and the considerations, and how it affects healthcare going forward. So we really, I really think that that's something you should put on your calendar. You'll enjoy the story, and I think it's obviously very important to the country. So with that, I thank you for participating. Again, we had a great crowd and from all over the world. I appreciate the outreach. I'm very, very impressed with the questions. We had 2 pages of really quality questions. So I think you're engaged, and I think Scott did a wonderful job of handling them. So with that, we'll call it a day, and I hope everyone has a great week out here.